Welcome back to another edition of Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the StrategyCorp Institute of Public Policy and Economy. I'm your host, Sebastian Lebrec. If you follow the work of StrategyCorp, you've probably already heard of our Ontario Municipal Chief Administrative Officer Survey, or CAO survey for short. By this point, this survey is very much a tradition around here. The 2025 report was the 8th edition of the survey. With all of the Trump uncertainty and a municipal election a year away, it was a very, very interesting time to engage with CAOs to hear their views on pressing issues. From geopolitics to housing to strong mayor powers, the 2025 CAO survey covers multiple topics that impact local governments and communities. To help us unpack some of the findings from the survey, I invited two of the lead authors. Joining me on the podcast today are municipal affairs veterans, Stacy Hushion, Vice President, and Joanne Chianello, Senior Advisor. Thank you so much for being here. So let's start by zooming out a little bit. When you think CAO survey, you think municipal. But I noticed that this year's edition mentioned geopolitical dynamics quite a bit. So how is that impacting local government, Stacy?
Yeah, so when we first started this report, you used to be able to do the entire report, give a presentation on it without any other reference to any government outside of the government of Ontario, so the provincial government. And that's simply not the case anymore. Municipalities need to keep an eye focused on what is happening beyond, even quite far beyond their borders. And I think what we're seeing is that global events are forcing a bit of a shift in priorities that are going to have impacts on municipalities.
So you both conducted interviews and did a lot of the writing. Joanne, were you at all surprised that Trump came up during interviews?
Well, not really, because if you think about it, these interviews happened in the spring of this year on the heels of two elections, Ontario's provincial election in February, I believe, and also the federal election in April. Those were both about who can best take on Donald Trump on behalf of Ontarians and on behalf of Canadians. And so it was very much top of mind. People are feeling a lot of stress about that. There are whole communities affected by these tariffs, especially if your industries in your city are based on steel or on, the auto sector. Now, to be fair, a couple of communities were benefiting from it. All the staycationing and local tourism, places like, cottage country, places that are tourist attractions, they benefited from that. But overall, really, there's a lot of concern. It also actually was a huge concern because, of course, it feeds into the economic uncertainty that people are feeling. So when we talk about there's a housing crisis or a building crisis or people not, buying new homes, well, they're very concerned about buying a new home when they're not sure if their jobs are going to get cut. If prices are going to get higher. And so that is having a huge impact on people in general and on communities. As well, I think that the geopolitical issues also spilled out beyond the US. There are wars in Ukraine, in the Middle East. There were a lot of demonstrations in municipalities. We saw a rise in hate crimes. This is a lot of local pressure on local politicians, on the systems like police forces, first responders, and emotions are running really high in a lot of municipalities, which is completely understandable. We got a couple of great quotes. From one CAO said that they did a community survey during the spring, and they were showing people were really angry, but it was like all about issues that are outside of the municipality's control. And another one said, I would call the incivility we've seen in our community as global geopolitical instabilities, like global impacts have an effect, on the local scene. And so it's a really difficult culture and moment for municipalities to address. And a lot of it is just things that are not even actually things that are in their powers to address.
So Stacy, Joanne mentioned incivility. I know we have a full chapter on this. What did you hear from CAOs?
So we've been covering this issue for the last couple of years and really seeing it escalate over time. Now, incivility is effectively the new normal, right? It is directly impacting municipal operations. I absolutely want to be clear about that. And we continued to hear this year, just like last year, alarming incidents of harassment, abuse, even physical assault of both elected officials and staff. So, from our perspective, working in this sector every day, this is very worrisome. And in addition to kind of the immediate impacts on people's physical and mental well-being from such incidents, the real risk that we see is that they discourage participation in local democracy and they kind of erode the foundations of our democratic institutions, both locally and perhaps more broadly as well, as Joanne was touching on a moment earlier. Who wants to run for office or join the local public service if they risk getting punched at work or facing hateful language or discriminatory language from members of the public or their colleagues or elected officials? That kind of stuff is not in the job description, right? And the risk, ultimately, the biggest risk is that this waters down the diversity and the quality not only of candidates for municipal office or to serve in the public service, but of the very nature of civic debate in general, right? And so that's something that, we're deeply concerned about, is the way that this has transformed from what was perhaps something of the moment or crisis to now a new normal. And, nobody at StrategyCorp would say that this is a new normal that we want to live with in perpetuity.
Joanne, you covered municipal affairs in the media. You were on social media, so I'm sure you've seen stuff, to say the least. So how have you seen this kind of evolved when it comes to incivility? But perhaps most importantly, is there a way to restore civility in the local context, you think?
Yeah, so I'm going to show my age here, Sebastian, and say that I was a reporter during the era where social media was invented, right? So when I started as a reporter 30 years ago, there was no Twitter, there was no Facebook. We had other problems, but there was, I think less access to information. I literally covered the start of the internet when I first started at the Financial Post and the Ottawa Citizen back in the day. But so, lots of things have changed for the good, but the amount of vitriol online is shocking now. It is nothing that and I saw it when Twitter started. I was on in 2009. It was a lot of fun. And after a few years, it sort of got worse and worse. That anonymity allows people to spread misinformation, disinformation, target people online with really horrible stuff, as we know, especially women, especially racialized folks. We heard CAOs say that because of incivility, if they had known where they were going to end up, they're not sure that they actually would have chosen this career path. It is a huge barrier to people. If you think about it, most people don't deal with this in their workplace. They don't go, to work. If you're a federal bureaucrat here in Ottawa, people probably don't know who you are, right? But if you are, the GM of transit or planning or the city manager here, they might actually know you. They come to talk to you in the grocery store. We heard CAOs be very concerned about counselors going out onto the who are out and about because they're recognized, especially female counselors who we are seeing, more people say they're not going to run. Now, you did say, though, what can we do about it? The province has actually put forward something called the Municipal Accountability Act, Bill 9, and it kind of mandates standardized codes of conduct and training for council members on their roles versus the roles of staff. And this is important because often the root of the problem is council members interfering in staff's jobs, not respecting their professional expertise, and sometimes lambasting them at public meetings, and then the public piles on. So Bill 9 does address that. However, it also, Bill 9 made headlines because it has a proposal to boot out council members who, have behaved in the worst possible ways. Now, there's a lot of concern about, the proposed removal process, but that's going to be coming to the legislature this fall. So we'll see if it's amended and what's happening there. But the province is taking a look at that. And there's a lot of things that municipalities can do on the ground themselves. They should review their security and safety procedures, can train their staff on, how to de-escalate certain situations. As Stacy alluded to earlier, that's not something you signed up for. Like if you're a policy analyst in planning or environmental services, you don't think that part of your job is, that you have to be trained on how to de-escalate an issue at a public meeting. But that's where we're at now. There's a lot of codes of conduct, council staff relations, and policies that can protect staff and other folks. And it's really important that municipalities make sure that the staff and public know what these procedures are and also how the complaints process works so that people can actually address these issues.
Okay, so switching gear a little bit here, the CAO survey has a full chapter on strong mayor powers. I'm sure CAOs had a lot of things to say about this topic. As a matter of fact, it could probably be its own podcast episode, but let's just make it a question in this podcast. So, Stacy, tell me, what was the intended objective of the Strong Mayor Power Initiative?
So the province instituted strong mayors to support the delivery of housing more quickly in line with their objectives to build 1.5 million homes by 2031, I believe. So, I think one area where the province could be and probably should be commended is that, they are trying to really empty out that toolbox when it comes to the housing file. Are we looking at all of the various policy and process improvements that could be made to bring more housing online more quickly? But that said, if we are strictly measuring whether strong mayors has on balance led to the creation of more housing, I think the data would tell you that no. Notwithstanding some limited cases in some municipalities where strong mayors have moved resolutions to advance some housing projects, such as in the city of Hamilton. So I do think it would be unfair to say that strong mayors have done absolutely nothing to support housing, but it's not a slam dunk. And there's currently no evidence to suggest that, strong mayors have achieved that stated objective of bringing, more housing more quickly to Ontario.
So this podcast is called Intended Consequences, but I'm going to ask a question about unintended consequences now. And I'm going to go to you, Joanne. Do you think the strong mayors had any kind of unintended consequences?
Well, I can't see into the soul of the PC government, so I'm not sure what they intended those consequences to be, but they certainly had a lot of consequences outside housing. In fact, other than like the one or two instances that Stacy mentioned as well, the strong mayor powers has mostly been used to unilaterally hire and fire chief administrative officers and other senior staff folks, because that is actually one of the powers that people didn't really understand. I know a lot of critics, when this first came out, I was still in media at the time, said, well, look, if this is about housing, why is it that you're taking away the power of council to hire and fire chief administrative officers and giving it to one person only, the mayor? And what we heard from CAOs is, some of them are great. Some of them have great relationships with their mayors. And there are many, many mayors very reluctant to use the strong mayor powers. But it kind of hovers over the CAOs jobs, right? This idea that, well, I could be fired. And a lot of them feel as if the job is changing into more of a chief of staff for the mayor, a political job, as opposed to a neutral professional job of leading a local public service. This can be very dangerous. And so you see CAOs already looking for more protection in their contracts, maybe shorter terms, bigger severance, because there's less job stability. And a lot of people are worried about the next election, especially in smaller municipalities that maybe don't get as much public attention. They're already hearing that some candidates are running on a platform of firing staff. And so, you don't hear of people running on a platform of, I'm going to use the strong mayor powers to increase housing starts. And here's the most unintended consequence. One CAO told us that in their municipality, the mayor is kind of anti-intensification and actually used the strong mayor powers to stop a development. So that's fairly unintended, I would say.
That's fair. So let's keep talking about municipal provincial relations. So, when I was a kid, we would play this game, hot or cold. If you're closer to the target, you're hot. If you're further away, you're cold. So let's frame it in hot and cold. How is the relationship right now between the provincial government and municipal governments, Stacy?
So I would say it's probably tepid, like a nice glass of tap water. There's a definite improvement over the last few years. We heard from CAOs, expressed appreciation for housing enabling infrastructure funding, as well as, some consideration that, hey, the province is starting to listen to us on a few files. So there's a sense that it's better, but I'd say it's better, but. And that but holds a lot of weight. So there's continued frustration, for example, with the paternalistic tone of the province. And you can read this throughout that chapter on provincial municipal relations, but also throughout the report where the province is, the big brother or the parent, and municipalities are kind of the unwieldy toddler that needs to be managed. And so, CAOs have really been quite clear that that's not the way the relationship should or perhaps does actually work in practice, and that, they want to be true partners with the province. So kind of getting rid of that hierarchical relationship, notwithstanding what is stated in the Municipal Act, but starting to work together as partners in a shared set of objectives. CAOs told us that they think that they could really help the province achieve those areas where, their goals align, for example, on housing. They also think that they could support the province in designing policy solutions that are optimized from the get-go for implementation. Municipalities can surface considerations about how some of this would work on the ground earlier on before the legislative process to avoid rework, to avoid walkbacks of legislation that we've seen the province have to do because, things haven't worked exactly as planned. And ultimately what they do want to be as true partners. And this goes to the other key finding this year is in order to be a true partner, your partner needs to ask you what you think and listen to what you say. And so that's the other thing we heard a lot about was the need for meaningful consultation, not just this theater of consultation.
So in your answers, you mentioned, things like housing, you mentioned health, you mentioned, a bunch of topics. So I guess my question is, I think one thing that is clear from the surveys is that the role of municipalities is expanding. It's much broader than it used to be. So what did you hear from CAOs on this? And that sounds like a bit of a perfect storm in a sense that you have more roles, but you don't necessarily have more revenues. That's definitely something I've heard my colleague Michael Fenn talk about in the past. So Stacy, what did you hear on the ever-expanding role of municipalities?
Status quo. Basically, that Michael Fenn is right, Michael Fenn is always right, but that what he's been talking about for years continues to be the case, that municipal responsibilities are expanding. And you can read the Municipal Act that has been revised over time to add to that list of areas in which municipalities have broad powers. But what they're not given are the tools or the funding that will enable them to actually make meaningful movement within those policy areas. Climate change is a good example of that, where the Municipal Act allows municipalities to work in that space, to take action in that space, to pass bylaws in that space. They have broad powers there. But there's not a ton of funding related, especially at the provincial level for climate change. And yet municipalities, because they are embedded in the local environment, they are seeing the direct impacts of climate change on, their infrastructure. They're seeing extreme weather events impact, homes and businesses. They're seeing flooding, fires. And so I think the problem is not getting any better. The biggest solution that municipalities have repeatedly asked for, that the associations, including AMO, have repeatedly asked for, as well as FCM, I should mention, have asked for a new fiscal deal to better encapsulate the growing role of municipalities in areas that have not traditionally been within their jurisdiction. All of these associations, many municipalities, CAOs that we have talked to throughout the entire lifespan of this survey have said the property tax was not designed to fund these types of social or community services, or even things like climate change. They were designed to fund services to property, so hard infrastructure.
And if I can add to that, I always find it interesting to remember that Ontario is the only province in Canada where municipalities are responsible for delivering social services. And like some of those are cost shared with the province, but I don't think fairly, a lot of municipalities say, why are we paying 25 or 30% for public health when health is like specifically a provincial responsibility under, I would mention, the Constitution, right? Municipalities are only obligated to run one long-term care home, but they run more because there's a need that isn't being met, right? So sure, there's homelessness and mental health and addiction issues, which do fall, are issues that should fall on more reasonably under provincial mandates. But on the other hand, when you see people who are suffering in your community, you reach out and you try to help as best you can. It's what the public demands. It's what council demands. The public doesn't really understand or care sometimes about the constitutional division of powers. But it is a huge problem for municipalities because they do not have a way to fund these. And, my favorite quote actually from one CAO is that the property tax is not a way of subsidizing provincial obligations. And you hear that a lot. We hear it every year. And I think as social issues become worse, that unfair downloading is also becoming a bigger problem for municipalities.
It almost takes us back to the beginning of the conversation, right? Because I asked you, the CAO survey is usually just, about municipalities. And here you are, Joanne, talking about the Constitution. And so I think it really kind of puts a bow on the conversation. But I do have one more question, and perhaps that's a bit of a tricky one. So we know, we spent more than 25 minutes highlighting some of the challenges facing local governments, the high degree of incivility right now. So why would anyone want to run for council next year? Or on the flip side, why would anyone want to work in the municipal civil service? We're going to go to both of you, perhaps Stacy first.
Sure. So, I think about this all the time and I get asked this all the time, like, why would anybody want to do this? But I think in everything our team does, in the CAO survey, in our direct work on projects with municipalities all over Ontario and even across Canada, what we see in everything is a passion for public service, both on the elected official side and on the civil service side. People want to serve their communities. They want to make a difference, and that hasn't changed. Even in spite of all of these challenges, there are still people who get up and say, I want to serve. And if anything, in the moment we're living right now, I'd offer that passion for public service and doing something in the public good is more important than ever. I recently heard Jane Goodall's last interview that was to be shared after her death. And I'm not sure if you folks have had a chance to listen to it, but I found it very impactful. And her message was that every individual can make a difference, that we should not lose hope, that what we do matters, that we matter as individuals. So I would encourage anybody that wants to run for office or to fill out an application to work in a municipal administration, to take that perspective. You can make a difference. You can leave things a little bit better than when you started there. Is the job tough? You bet. Is being a counselor tough? Yes. Is working for a municipality tough? Absolutely. It's not the 9-to-5 kind of easy dream that people think it is. But every one of the toughest jobs in life is usually something worth doing. Having children, taking a professional leap, right? Are you fully ready? Maybe not. Can you ever be ready? I'm not sure. But are you at least willing to try? That's really what matters. And so running for council or, taking a job in a municipality is no different. And so I continue to be inspired by the people who want to take on these roles in spite of the challenges, because they really think that there's good that they can do. And we need to encourage that.
But I completely agree. It's a huge cliche to say, oh, local government is the government closest to the people, but it's actually true. And we just spent a half hour talking about the ways that is a huge challenge for people sometimes. You make decisions that touch people every day in every part of their lives, and maybe you don't feel that your level of government is supported by the upper tiers the way they should be. But it is because it touches every part of your life, from the time you get up to the time you go to bed, because there's more work to be done. That's why we need good people who will keep fighting to help rebuild trust in government and public institutions. People who will keep pestering the province and the feds for that new deal that we need, who are interested in boring, nerdy policies because they understand how much that matters to the everyday lives of people. So yes, is it for the faint of heart, this job? No, it is not. But what meaningful job really is.
Well, those were tremendous answers. So I'm glad I squeezed that last one question in there. I know for a fact that putting together the CAO survey is a huge undertaking. But, I think one thing that is clear from this podcast and this discussion is how much this is a labor of love, and it's because we care. And because you care. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show today to talk about some of the key findings from the 2025 CAO survey. I obviously recommend to our listeners to take a look at the survey. And perhaps if you don't want to read 110 pages, maybe listen to this episode. Thank you so much, Joanne and Stacy.
Thanks, Steph.
Thank you. If I can ask one thing, if any listeners do end up running for office or taking a job in a municipality, please write to us. And maybe Joanne and I will do a bit of a traveling roadshow to stew up some motivation.
That sounds like a deal. Thank you so much. The views expressed during this podcast are not necessarily the views of StrategyCorp. All rights for this episode are reserved, and the guests on the Intended Consequences podcast might be current or past clients of StrategyCorp. To find out more about the work of the Institute and to subscribe to our newsletter, visit our website at strategycorp.com/institute and make sure to follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. I'm Sebastian Lebrec, and I intend to talk to you again next episode.